They laughed at my trembling hands, whispering that I couldn't even sign my own checks. But little did they know, those hands still held the power to change everything. My name is Celeste Harper, and before I begin this story, let me greet you properly. Hello, dear friends. Thank you for joining me today. I'd love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments, won't you? I always enjoy hearing from people across the world. It reminds me that no matter where we live, our struggles, our joys, and our stories are often more alike than we imagine. Now let me take you back into my life. The life of a woman who was once respected, admired, even envied. A woman who built a life brick by brick with her late husband, only to one day be treated as though she were fragile porcelain, chipped and useless. You see, I was never a weak woman. My husband, Richard, and I built everything we had from the ground up. We worked our land, invested wisely, and made sacrifices that only those of our generation truly understand. No instant luxuries, no shortcuts, just honest work, careful decisions, and a steadfast faith that tomorrow would reward today's efforts. And it did. We lived comfortably, never extravagantly, but with enough to know we'd done well for ourselves. But time, as it always does, changed everything. Richard passed away before his hair even turned fully white, leaving me to carry the torch alone. I did so proudly, determined to honor his memory. For years, I managed our affairs, paid bills, handled investments, kept the family afloat. People admired me for it. At least, they did back then. And then my hands began to shake. It started small. A little tremor when I reached for a teacup. A subtle quiver when I tried to write a grocery list. I laughed it off at first, telling myself it was just age catching up. But soon enough, others noticed. And where there is weakness, there will always be someone eager to exploit it. I remember the first time it truly cut me. I was at the bank, standing at the counter, trying to sign a check. The pen felt heavier than it had ever felt before, as if it were made of stone. My signature came out wobbly, jagged, not the steady line it had always been. I heard it then, a whisper behind me. One of my own nieces, of all people, chuckling to another relative. Look at her. She can't even sign a check properly. The words stung more deeply than I can describe. In that moment, the years of sacrifice, the dignity I had carried, all seemed invisible. To them, I was reduced to a shaky hand and a failing body. They didn't see the woman who had managed businesses, overseen land deals, or sat up at midnight balancing ledgers while her children slept. No, all they saw was someone teetering on the edge of uselessness. After that, the whispers became a chorus. Every family gathering, every bank visit, every interaction seemed to carry with it a shadow of mockery. I caught their smirks, their sideways glances. They spoke of me as though I were already gone, as though I were nothing more than a relic waiting to be boxed up and forgotten. And yet, inside, I burned with a quiet fire, because what they failed to understand was that weakness in one part of the body does not erase strength in another. Yes, my hands trembled. Yes, my writing had become less steady. But my mind, oh, my mind was as sharp as ever. I remembered every detail of our land ownership, every bond purchased, every account opened. I knew exactly where everything was, and exactly how to move it if I wished. They thought they were watching me decline. What they didn't realize was that I was watching them too, watching their greed, their impatience, their eagerness to swoop in and claim what Richard and I had built. And as I watched, a seed of determination began to sprout within me. I decided then, I would not die humiliated. I would not let them dance on the grave of my dignity. I would not be remembered as the old woman who couldn't even sign her name. Number. I would remind them, in the most unforgettable way, that these shaky hands could still write an ending more powerful than any beginning. And so, my plan quietly began to take shape. I often find myself drifting back to the years when Richard and I were just starting out, because those memories remind me of who I truly am. It is easy, when your body begins to falter, to believe the cruel lies people whisper, that age makes you useless, that trembling hands mean a trembling mind. But when I close my eyes, I can still see the woman I was, and she is still here. Richard and I married young, in a small church on the edge of town. We didn't have much, only a patch of land that his father left him and a determination to make it bear fruit. He was a kind man, strong in spirit, if not always in body. I was the one who kept the books, made plans, and held him steady when doubts crept in. Together, we worked that land until our hands cracked and our backs ached. But slowly, year after year, it yielded. When the farm finally gave more than we needed, Richard wanted to celebrate, perhaps buy something grand. But I convinced him otherwise. I told him wealth is like water. It slips away unless you channel it wisely. So instead of wasting it, we began to invest. A little at first, government bonds, a parcel of land on the outskirts of town, and later, a few shares in companies that were just beginning to grow. I studied everything I could get my hands on: newspapers, investment pamphlets, even the dull speeches politicians gave about the economy. Richard used to laugh when he caught me reading financial reports by lamplight. "Celeste," he'd say, "most women read recipes or fashion magazines. You're the only one I know who reads about market yields for fun." But he trusted me, and that trust paid off. By the time we were middle-aged, we had a small but respectable fortune. Nothing ostentatious. We didn't buy flashy cars or diamonds. But we had stability. We had land, bonds, and a home filled with warmth. And we had respect. People looked at us and said, "There go Richard and Celeste Harper, a couple who built their lives with their own hands." That memory sustains me, because it proves that I was never a fool, never a helpless woman. And though my hands might shake now, my mind still carries all the wisdom of those years. But others don't see that. They see only the surface, an old widow whose body betrays her. They forget the decades that shaped me, the nights when I balanced the ledgers to the penny, the boldness it took to buy land when everyone else was selling. I remember sitting one afternoon, staring at the sunlight falling across the living room rug, listening to the faint tremor in my own fingers as they tapped against the arm of my chair. And I thought, why am I allowing them to define me? Why am I letting their cruel laughter shape my story? That was the moment when my quiet resolve began to harden into a plan. I realized something they didn't know. Every deed, every bond, every certificate was still in my possession. Richard had trusted me to keep them safe, and I had never failed him. They thought they were circling a helpless woman, waiting for her fortune to fall into their laps. But they didn't realize the fortune was already in my grasp, and I could make it vanish if I chose. And so I began to think, how much was the land worth now? What about those bonds? They had matured, hadn't they? The thought of it filled me with a strange, secret excitement. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. There was one thing I knew for certain. I would not leave my legacy in their greedy hands. I would take everything Richard and I had built, and I would decide where it went. It was almost amusing, really. They thought my shaking hands made me incapable of even signing a check. But those same hands could still sign deeds, transfer bonds, and withdraw every penny. I smiled to myself then, a small, private smile they would never see, because even though my fingers trembled, my resolve was steady. I began to imagine it, the shock on their faces when they realized what I had done, the disbelief when they discovered that, despite their ridicule, I had outmaneuvered them all. But before I could make that vision real, I needed to prepare, quietly, carefully, without arousing suspicion. Because in families like mine, Word spreads faster than fire in dry grass. If even one of them caught wind of my intentions, they would swarm like hornets. So I began, step by step, to plan my next move. It is a peculiar kind of pain when the sharpest wounds are dealt not by strangers, but by those who share your blood. I could have endured the whispers of neighbours, the sideways looks of acquaintances. But when the mockery came from my own kin, the very people Richard and I once fed at our table, clothed in winters and guided through life, that was a cruelty I could not forgive. One memory is burned into me as if carved with a hot iron. It was a Sunday, after church. My sister's children, along with a few cousins, had stopped by. We were gathered in the sitting room, the air heavy with the smell of the roast I had worked all morning to prepare. I had been proud of myself. My hands had only shaken a little as I peeled the potatoes, and the meal had turned out well. After dinner, I pulled out my checkbook to pay the boy who delivered firewood earlier in the week. As I tried to write his name, my hand quivered badly. The pen scratched across the page like a nervous bird. I muttered under my breath, willing it to steady, but it was no use. That's when I heard it. My niece, Charlotte, whispering to her brother. She thought I wouldn't catch it, but I did. Honestly, she can't even sign a check. How is she supposed to handle all those accounts? Her brother snorted, and they both stifled their laughter like naughty children sharing a dirty joke. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. I wanted to slam the book shut, to tell them that I had managed finances long before they even knew how to count, that I had built a life while they had squandered theirs. But I bit my tongue. Dignity is not in shouting, it is in silence. Still, their laughter echoed in my ears for days afterward. And it wasn't only them. At family gatherings, I would notice their eyes flicking to my hands whenever I reached for a glass or tried to carve meat. My cousins, who once asked me for advice about buying land, now exchanged smirks as if I were a senile fool. Even my brother's wife, a woman who owed me more kindness than I could ever repay, remarked once, within earshot, "She's slipping. Can't keep things straight anymore." Oh, how wrong they were. Their cruelty did something unexpected. It didn't break me. It steeled me. With every sly remark, every mocking whisper, I felt my resolve harden. If they saw me as nothing more than a trembling relic, then I would show them just how wrong they were. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I whispered aloud, almost as though Richard were sitting across from me again. "They think I am finished, but they've forgotten who I am." And I remembered. I remembered the woman who once walked into a bank with only $10 to deposit and walked out years later with the deeds to 3 parcels of land. I remembered the woman who negotiated with bankers twice her size and never once flinched. I remembered the woman who built a future with her husband, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and refused to let anyone tell her she couldn't. Those memories were my armor. Still, I had to be clever. I couldn't simply confront them. That would give them power. No, I had to move silently, like the tide that erodes the shore without anyone noticing until the sand is gone. The cruelty of my family became the spark that lit the fire. But the flame itself, oh, that came from something deeper. It came from a promise I made long ago, a promise to Richard. On the night he lay dying, his hand clasped mine, still steady then, and he whispered, "Take care of what we built, Celeste. Don't let anyone waste it, I promised him I would." And I intended to keep that promise, no matter what it cost me. So as my relatives smirked and whispered, thinking they were clever, I sat quietly, nodding, smiling even, letting them believe I was fading. All the while, I was planning, because while they were laughing at my trembling hands, I was preparing to take every last thing they expected to inherit. And oh, how sweet the silence was as I imagined the moment their laughter would turn to gasps. Once my decision was made, there was no turning back. I knew I had to move quickly. quietly, and with precision. My relatives believed I was too frail to manage even a simple signature, which, in a way, became my greatest disguise. Nobody suspects a woman they think is helpless. The first step was the lawyer. Mr. Alden had been our family attorney for decades, a man who had known Richard and me since our earliest days of building a life together. His hair was as white as winter frost, and his eyes carried the same kind of sharpness mine still did. When I asked for a private meeting, he didn't hesitate. I remember the way his eyebrows lifted ever so slightly when I told him what I intended. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "are you sure you want to do this? It will mean disappearing, in a sense. Your family will not understand." I leaned forward, my trembling hands folded tightly in my lap. "Mr. Alden, my family hasn't tried to understand me for years. Let them laugh. This isn't about them. It's about me, about Richard, about dignity." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll begin." I signed the necessary authorizations, slowly, carefully, willing my hand to obey me just long enough. Each signature was a small victory, a silent declaration. I am not powerless. The ink may have wavered, but the intention behind it was ironclad. Next came the banker, Mr. Rowe. He was younger than Alden, ambitious but respectful. I requested a discreet meeting in his office. As I walked in, leaning slightly on my cane, I could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes when I told him exactly what I wanted: liquidation of certain accounts, transfer of matured bonds, and preparation for large withdrawals. "Mrs. Harper," he said, choosing his words carefully, "are you planning something?" I met his gaze. My voice, though soft, carried no tremor. "I am planning to ensure that everything I worked for goes where it should. That is all you need to know." He hesitated, then nodded. Perhaps he sensed there was steel beneath my fragile exterior, or perhaps he simply admired the courage of a woman determined to act. Whatever it was, he carried out my instructions without delay. The land was the hardest part. That land was Richard's pride, the soil we had worked with our own hands, the foundation of our lives. Selling it felt almost like betrayal. But then I remembered his words on his deathbed. "Don't let anyone waste it." And waste it they surely would have, parceling it off, squabbling over it, draining it of its worth. Better I sell it myself and use the money with purpose. The sale was arranged quietly through a trusted broker. He was an old acquaintance, someone who understood discretion. We met in his office after hours, the blinds drawn, the desk lamp casting long shadows. I signed the deed with steady determination, even though my hand trembled more than ever. When the pen lifted from the paper, I felt something loosen inside me, a weight I had carried for too long. Piece by piece, the life Richard and I had built was being transformed. Land turned into cash, bonds transferred, accounts restructured, and with every move, I felt the power flowing back into me, like a current that had been dammed for too long. At home, I said nothing. I went about my days as though nothing had changed, enduring the whispers and smirks of my relatives. They thought they were watching me wither. In truth, I was watching them, testing how blind their greed had made them. Not one of them suspected a thing. There were nights, of course, when doubt crept in. I would sit by the window, staring at the moonlit yard, and wonder if I was being too harsh. These were, after all, my own flesh and blood. Was I wrong to outwit them so completely? But then I would recall the sting of their laughter, the way they spoke of me as though I were already gone, and I would remember Richard's voice, calm, steady, resolute. "Take care of what we built, Celeste." That voice silenced my doubts. By the end of it, the arrangements were complete. What they thought was still sitting in banks, tied up in land and bonds, was already gone, placed beyond their reach. All that remained was the final step: the one that would turn their ridicule into silence. I would leave, quietly, completely, without a word. And when the banker called their names, expecting to hand them my legacy, they would find nothing. Only then would they understand that trembling hands can still shape destiny. The night I left was colder than most, though it was not the air that chilled me, it was the weight of finality pressing against my chest. I had spent weeks making the arrangements, each signature and transaction pulling me further away from the life I had known. Now, there was only one step left: to vanish. I packed quietly, methodically. A small suitcase, nothing more. Clothes that were simple and practical. A few keepsakes I could not bear to part with. Richard's pocket watch, a faded photograph of us standing by the farm in our youth, and a worn, leather-bound book where I had kept notes on every financial decision we ever made. It was strange, really, how little I needed to carry, considering the life we had built. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, my footsteps soft against the wooden floors. Each room whispered memories to me. The kitchen where I baked bread for Richard on Sunday mornings. The parlour where we hosted neighbours during harvest festivals. The bedroom where his laughter once filled the night. Every corner carried echoes of the life we had shared. And yet, I knew I could not stay. To remain would be to hand everything over to those who mocked me, to let them circle like vultures until there was nothing left. Leaving was not abandonment. It was liberation. I paused at the window, gazing out at the moonlit yard. The trees swayed gently, their branches scratching against the siding like fingers waving goodbye. For a moment, my resolve wavered. What if I was wrong? What if disappearing was too cruel? But then I remembered Charlotte's cruel whisper, the smirks, the dismissive tones. I remembered the sting of humiliation when they said I couldn't even sign a check. My chest tightened with resolve. I whispered softly into the night, as though Richard were standing beside me. "It's time, my love. I won't let them win." With that, I lifted my suitcase and walked out the door. I didn't slam it shut, didn't lock it. I left it ajar, as if to say, let them come in, let them see the emptiness, let them realize too late what they have lost. The station was quiet at that hour. A thin fog curled across the platform, cloaking everything in an eerie stillness. I sat on the bench, my suitcase at my feet, and waited for the train. My hands shook, yes, but not from weakness this time. It was adrenaline, the thrill of freedom coursing through me. When the train arrived, I boarded with steady steps. The whistle blew, and as the wheels began to turn, I felt something shift inside me. The house, the land, the laughter of my youth, the mocking whispers of my old age, all of it receded into the distance. What remained was only me, Celeste Harper, and the knowledge that I had taken control of my fate. The ride was long, giving me plenty of time to think. I looked out at the passing fields and towns, each mile carrying me further from the people who had underestimated me. There was sadness. Yes, leaving behind the familiar always carries grief. But beneath it was something stronger: exhilaration. For the first time in years, I felt like the author of my own story again. I imagined the moment my relatives would discover my absence, their surprise at finding the house empty, the land sold, the bonds transferred. I imagined their panic when they rushed to the bank, only to be met with silence. And then, the moment the banker would call their names. That image warmed me like a fire on a cold night. When the train pulled into a distant town, I stepped off with quiet confidence. Nobody here knew me. I was just another traveller, another face among many. I found a modest boarding house run by a kind widow who asked no questions. With the money I had secured, I knew I could start anew. Not lavishly, not extravagantly, but with dignity. For the first time in a long while, I slept peacefully. No whispers, no mocking eyes, No vultures circling, just silence, and the gentle rhythm of a new beginning. In disappearing, I had not lost myself. I had reclaimed myself, and as I drifted into sleep, I knew that somewhere, perhaps only in spirit, Richard was smiling. I wasn't there to witness it with my own eyes, but oh, how clearly I can imagine it. The banker himself later told me enough for me to piece it all together, and in truth, I had pictured that day so many times in my mind that I can see it as if I were sitting in the room. The day my family thought would mark their triumph became the day their laughter died. It was a crisp morning when they marched into the bank, dressed in their finest clothes. Charlotte, the niece who mocked me most, wore a new hat with feathers so tall they nearly brushed the doorframe. Her brother walked beside her, puffed up with self-importance. My cousins trailed behind, their faces hungry, eyes glinting with expectation. They had come to claim what they believed was theirs: the land, the bonds, the accounts, my life's work, Richard's legacy. They thought they had finally cornered the trembling widow into surrendering all she owned. The banker, Mr. Rowe, greeted them with his usual politeness. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please, take a seat." Charlotte smiled sweetly, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're here about Aunt Celeste's accounts. We understand well, she isn't in a position to manage things anymore." Mr. Rowe adjusted his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, I am aware of Mrs. Harper's situation." They leaned forward eagerly. "Then let's proceed," her brother said, rubbing his hands together. "We'll need access to her accounts, the bonds, the land deeds." Mr. Rowe raised a hand, cutting him off with quiet authority. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." A hush fell over the room. "What do you mean?" Charlotte demanded. He looked down at the papers before him, then back up at their anxious faces. "Mrs. Harper has already liquidated her land holdings. The bonds were transferred weeks ago. And as for the accounts, those too were closed or moved at her instruction." The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of Charlotte's feathers trembling as she whipped her head around to glare at her brother. "That can't be right," her cousin sputtered. "She couldn't have done that. She can't even sign her own name without trembling?" Mr. Rowe finished for him, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Trembling or not, Mrs. Harper's signature is valid, and she executed every transaction herself. All was done legally and properly." The words struck them like stones. Charlotte's face flushed crimson. "Where did it go? Where is the money? The land? She couldn't have just taken it." Mr. Rowe leaned back, folding his hands calmly. "Where it went is no longer your concern. Mrs. Harper made her decisions privately, and I assure you, she knew exactly what she was doing." Voices rose around the table: disbelief, outrage, denial. One cousin slammed his hand down, rattling the banker's pens. Another muttered curses under her breath. Charlotte's eyes glistened with angry tears, her feathers trembling like a storm-struck bird. "They laughed at me," I whispered to myself when I later heard the story. But now, who is laughing? The banker described how the room dissolved into chaos. Relatives shouting over each other, demanding answers, insisting there must be a mistake. But Mr. Rowe held firm. Calm, professional, unshaken, he repeated the truth. Everything had been handled by Celeste Harper herself. At last, silence fell. Heavy, bitter, humiliating silence. They realized there was nothing left to fight for. No land, no bonds, no inheritance. Only the echo of their own laughter, now turned back upon them. I like to imagine their faces in that moment. Wide-eyed, slack-jawed, pale with shock. The same faces that once smirked at me, the same lips that whispered cruel words, now silenced by the power of the woman they underestimated. It was justice, pure and complete. And though I was far away, living quietly in my new home, I felt it, a ripple in the air, like the release of a long-held breath. They had mocked me for my trembling hands, but those hands had signed away everything they thought they owned. I had not shouted. I had not argued. I had not pleaded for respect. I had simply acted. And in the end, action speaks louder than laughter. The first morning I woke in my new life, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the peace of silence or the peace of solitude. It was the peace of knowing that I had taken back control of my story. I rented a modest cottage in a quiet town far enough away that no one knew the name Celeste Harper. To the grocer, I was simply Mrs. H. To the children who ran past my gate on their way to school, I was just the kind lady who sometimes waved from the porch. There were no whispers about trembling hands, no smirks behind my back, just people who saw me as I was in that moment, a woman living her life quietly. I cannot tell you how liberating that felt. For so long, I had lived under the weight of others' expectations and judgments. Every family gathering was like standing trial, my every movement scrutinized, my every weakness highlighted. Here, in this new place, I was invisible in the best way. No one judged me. No one mocked me. I could simply be. Of course, there were moments of loneliness. I missed Richard's voice, most of all, his steady laugh, the way he would hold my hand when storms rattled the windows. At night, when the world was quiet, I sometimes reached for him in the dark, forgetting for a second that he was gone. But then I would remind myself, he would have been proud of me, proud that I stood firm, proud that I did not let anyone squander what we built. I filled my days with simple pleasures. I tended a small garden behind the cottage, planting roses and herbs that reminded me of our old home. I took long walks, cane in hand, greeting neighbours with a smile. I even joined the local library's reading circle, where nobody cared about my shaky fingers as long as I turned the pages gently, and in that simplicity, I found joy again. So I'll ask you once more, dear friends, where are you watching from today? Tell me, share with me, because in stories like mine, we are all connected. You, me, and everyone who has ever been underestimated. And together, we prove them wrong. This completes the full story in 7 sections, approx. 5,000 to 5,500 words total. Dramatic, emotional, and perfectly structured for YouTube storytelling, with a strong beginning, twists, and a powerful ending for an older audience. Would you like me to now compile all 7 sections into one continuous full script file, about 5,000 plus words, so you can use it directly?